Hello everyone, I am Mr. Smith. I am an English teacher at a British secondary school. It's bloody hot today, so you might see me looking a bit warm. I wanted to do a little video today in response to Solomon's video regarding the how translation changes over hundreds, if not thousands of years of time. And the reason I want to do this is because there's a lot of this within the world of English. There's a lot of context that's been lost, a lot of context that's been changed, a lot of words whose meanings have been lost. So I want to do this little video to sort of point out just how difficult it is to translate a historical text, even from English to English. And to that end, I'm going to be using Mr. Shakespeare. Now, you'll have to excuse the tone. I've never done this before, so I've got my notes on here. So Solomon, he brought up a few good points. First one is that translation is difficult. Okay, so this is true for historical documents and anything like even from just like French to German. Translation can always be difficult because words have changed. And the other thing is as well, Solomon's referring to the Odyssey. And the Odyssey, if you don't realise, is an epic poem. It's basically the first form of narrative writing we have, which is poetry and songs. So when you translate an older text based on rhythm, that's really difficult because, quite frankly, the flow can be lost, the rhythm can go. And it's up to you, as the translator, to decide whether you want to either preserve that rhythm or preserve the original meaning. But you can't just cast it aside because there is so much involved in that sense of rhythm. And of course, the third point, culture changes all the time. That makes meanings change, that makes, context change, that makes everything change that we could possibly need for the effort, for the act of translating a historical text. I'm linking it into English because I'm an English teacher and I do like history, so that's how I found this whole thing. And I'm linking it to William Shakespeare. The reason being is that so many of my pupils struggle with the context, with the general understanding of what life was like 500 years ago, how even 200 years ago. When we look at something like Charles Dickens, that's 200 years. That's not a lot, that's 4 generations really. When it comes to exploring this idea, I want to look at how these problems arise that Solomon mentioned in Shakespeare. And this can apply to any kind of text, but we're focusing on Shakespeare because, quite frankly, it is like an alien language at this point. I'm going to be focusing on Act 1, Scene 4. That is of Romeo and Juliet. And that's the infamous Queen Mab speech. Okay, so if you don't know Queen Mab or anything like that, basically the short version is Mercutio is absolutely fed up of Romeo going, "Oh, I'm so sad, oh, come on, have a party." So he starts going off on this massive tirade about this fictional folklore fairy in order to get Romeo cheered up and distracted. It's actually kind of kind in his own way. He is a bit of a teaser and he likes to mess with Romeo. That one's quite clear. So that's part of like this Queen Mab speech is like his introduction, and it really establishes to the audience that he is a comical character, that he is someone that is a little bit wild, a little bit flamboyant, for want of another word, and also someone that is going to be the light-hearted part of this tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, at least until he dies in Act 3. For this video, I'm going to be referring to a translated version of Romeo and Juliet. It is the Sparknotes No Fear Shakespeare version. Reason being is it's basically just the one that we buy in for the kids. So whenever we teach Romeo and Juliet or Othello, we have the No Fear Shakespeare version in order to basically get it across. And for the lower ability sets, we can easily just read the modern version, or I hate doing that, and you'll find out why soon. The first point I'm looking at is the fact that translation is difficult. Shakespeare lived over 500 years ago. So that is a massive gap between, the world we know today and the world that he grew up in. In terms of historical timescales, in terms of our species, in terms of the Earth and whatnot, it's a blip. And technically, even in terms of literature, it's a blip. But there has been so much change that when my kids look at many of these things happening, like the friar, mention of Friar Lawrence for one, they don't know what a friar is, and I don't blame them because I didn't. So I'm not saying friars don't exist; they still do. Look it up, genuinely. But the fact is that so much culture has changed or been lost that it has become really, really difficult for anyone to understand Shakespeare, not just the kids. Although we have all the records, in terms of public knowledge, loads of people just don't have that understanding of what life was like back then. I mean, and there's loads of gaps too. I mean, you have to consider every historical document has to last 500 years just for Shakespeare's time. And it's such a long time that we don't even know if we've got all of his plays. We don't even know if we have all of his poetry. There could be the magnum opus of Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare's works, and we just never found it. So it's one of those things where that makes translation difficult because it's a very, very different world to the one that we grew up in. There are loads of examples throughout the play, obviously, where words have either lost their meaning or completely changed their meaning to be something entirely different. In regards to Act 1, Scene 4, I'm going to be looking at these words here. So, gentle, alderman, and when Romeo says, direct my sail. Now, you may be thinking, well, hang on, I'm quite well read. I have an understanding of it. I can work out a gentle means kind. I can work out a sail means boat. May not know what an alderman is, but it sounds like someone important. And that's great. You can do that. You can work it out. That's, I'm not saying it's impossible. What I'm saying is it becomes quite difficult when things become quite muddled. Let me use that focus on, gentle to begin with. The word gentle, as we know it today, means someone that is kind or caring. So, for example, he put a gentle hand on my shoulder. All right, shows a bit of compassion. However, in Shakespeare's time, it actually meant someone who is of noble birth, a gentleman. Okay, someone who has, been born into a rich and wealthy family and is therefore a gentleman, someone of the upper classes. We have to work out, first of all, well, hang on, which one did Shakespeare mean? And then we think, well, it's obvious, he used the meaning of the time. But Shakespeare used the word gentle with his noble characters, but most commonly with his softer characters, most commonly with people like Cassio or Romeo. The fact is, our version of gentle essentially is how Shakespeare used it, even though he's referring to someone noble. And Macbeth is never called gentle. Gentle Macbeth, he's called noble Macbeth. So already we've got the waters muddy because Shakespeare was quite recent in our time. So we have to consider, did he influence our use of gentle? Did he use it in the way that we think to now? Not only that, but if he is using it in that method, is there another meaning behind that as well by Mercutio saying it? So I got this line here. Nay, gentle Romeo, we must have you dance. Is he saying, no, noble Romeo, we must have you dance? Is he saying, no, kind-hearted Romeo, we must have you dance? Or, because it's a patriarchal society and male expectations were obviously quite strong then, is he saying, no, you soft-hearted Romeo, we must have you dance? Is he teasing him? Is he having a jab at him? My whole point with this is that a simple word like gentle already has three potential meanings in terms of translation. Now, we can almost certainly just say, oh no, well, it meant noble back then, so we'll put it noble. We'll just use it as noble. But then, again, Macbeth is noble. He becomes king. He isn't called gentle. That's my point. We don't know what Shakespeare was thinking when he wrote them, when he wrote their dialogue. Did he just prefer gentle that day and noble for Macbeth, or what? And that's part of the issue. We can't ask him. So when we're translating a text from the past to current, we need to choose one of those three things to definitively say in our translation, this is what it means. Because that's the point of a translation. You're trying to tell someone what it means. If you start muddying the waters, you start saying, oh yeah, no, it could mean all three of these things, you're starting to lose the story. The next point I want to go over is the loss of rhythm with the translation. Because ultimately, when you're translating an older text that is poetic in nature, you have to make a choice to decide between keeping the meaning as clear cut as possible or keeping the original intention behind the use of rhythm, behind the use of beat. With something like the Odyssey, Greeks several thousand years ago, they always wrote in epic poems. Okay, when they wrote their stories, they wrote a massive epic poem that told the tales of these great heroes and these legends. Translating anything with rhythm is really difficult. I mean, anyone who translates songs from one language to another can tell you that. And it's doubly so for historical documents because, well, as I just said in my last point, words change, meanings change. So you can't use the exact same word with those sets of syllables to create the same effect because it doesn't really work anymore. When you do this, you have to ask yourself, how much are you willing to preserve? How much do you want to preserve? And how much do you have to change? In a way, it's a little bit like the age-old debate of, why can't this book be adapted perfectly into a film? Why do they have to change something? Which, as a side, I don't actually have an issue with, but that's a discussion for another time. Going back to Shakespeare, this issue of rhythm really matters because he wrote in something called iambic pentameter. Now, every time I say that to my kids, they always go, like, the eyes go wide and the mouths open, like, I'm never going to understand that. But although it's wordy, it's actually incredibly simple. Iambic pentameter is essentially saying that Shakespeare wrote in 5 heartbeats. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. And he did that for pretty much all of his works. He does dip in and out. Okay, he does switch to prose. Like Iago, for example, switches to prose for a little bit when he's revealing his evil side. So we're going to look at a bit of Mercutio's speech now about Queen Mab. And you're going to see how the iambic pentameter sort of floats and adds to Mercutio. She is the fairy's midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone, on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomi over men's noses as they lie asleep. Now, I did deliberately slow that so you could sort of pick out the iambic pentameter. However, you could see in that rhythm that it keeps bouncing with Mercutio. With Mercutio, the language that he uses, it's always particularly bouncy. So, she is the fairy's midwife. And that lends itself to Mercutio because it gives you this idea that he's sort of like dancing around to Romeo. He's poking him. He's jabbing at him. He's trying to say, like, come on, laugh. Because that's what he does. And if we look at the No Fear Shakespeare version, it is written in prose, so it isn't meant to keep the iambic pentameter. But let me just show you the effect of that. Now, I am going to try and read this in iambic pentameter. Not going to go well. She's the fairy's midwife. She's no bigger than the stone on a city councilman's ring. She rides around in our wagon. Jesus Christ. My point is, you can't carry over that iambic pentameter to this version. And so you've lost a lot of Mercutio because not only have you completely annihilated the iambic pentameter if you apply it, but the emphasis is all on the wrong words. So you lose that bounciness that you get from Mercutio. So it could quite literally just be read with a flat monotone start, like Mercutio's just telling Romeo a fact. Here, I'll show you. She's the fairy's midwife. She's no bigger than the stone on a city councilman's ring. She rides around in a wagon drawn by tiny little atomi, and she rides over men's noses as they lie sleeping. Let's go back. She is the fairy's midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomi over men's noses as they fall asleep. Can you see the point I'm trying to make here? Because I really hope you can. The fact is, in this translation, which is really good for helping kids and adults understand what's going on in this play, like they're just losing so much about Mercutio. Everyone just becomes a fact speller. Everyone just starts saying, oh yeah, the day's long, instead of "I me sad hours lengthen these days," or whatever it is. Romeo, I wasn't very good at cut that. I hate teaching iambic pentameter because so many kids just gloss over and like shut down. But it adds so much to the play, and when you have to keep referring to this very factual version, you lose so much of the character. Anyway, that's part of the issue. When it comes to these translations, when it comes to shifting from one to the other, from old to current, and you change that rhythm, you lose something of the original work. It isn't just about making it easily understood, because that takes away from the characters, that takes away from the original work. So again, that question comes up: how much of that rhythm do you preserve, and how much do you have to change to make it understood? And there's no right answer to that question. I'm not saying that this is bad. Again, I've said I really like No Fear's translation, but when you annihilate the rhythm, you annihilate something from the characters. Now, I've already sort of touched on the last point through the discussion on how difficult translating words can be because meanings change. But just to add to it, so obviously culture and context changes constantly. That's just the nature of progression. For example, when Romeo says, "He that hath the steerage of my course direct my sail," if he said it today, he probably would have said something along the lines of, "He that has my controller direct me." And the reason for that is because the context has changed. In Shakespeare's time, sails obviously referred to sailing ships, the big, fancy galleons that went all over the world, that created the British Empire, that create America and all these other areas around the world were previously explored, were achieved on these sailing ships. Everyone knew what one was. That's great. But these days, we don't really have sails on ships. So that context has completely been lost. I mean, to my kids, many of them think a sale is a thing that you get when someone buys something from you. In addition to that, growth as a society. Okay, as we grow and change the world and understand the world better around us and people better around us, our context will change. I mean, consider what Solomon said about the 90s version of the Odyssey's translation. It was considered woke for the time because it was very much focused on women's rights, on the equal roles of women within the narrative, and that's fantastic because Penelope is now the leader of the city of the island. She is queen. So why isn't she doing anything other than while Telemachus is out there feeding everybody and going off on an adventure? But that's part of that's our context. That's our modern context. That's us looking back and putting our current thoughts into something that not that it didn't exist, the concept of equal rights, but that people never considered because they were just hard locked into a patriarchal society. It's like if I asked you now to imagine a society without money. That you can't conceive it because we live in that capitalist society. Just as a personal example of this, Virginia Woolf, wrote in 1928 a fantastic story called Orlando. I had to read it for my university degree. And there's a moment in Orlando that's always sort of stuck with me, and that's when Orlando woke up and was now a woman. That always stuck with me because when I read it, I finally sort of had that moment of, I get it now. This whole, because at the time, transgender issues were still, in their early days, they were still being discussed. Well, I'd say early days, it's been going on for 50, forever. Because the thing is, you can't just say that these things didn't always exist, because they did. Okay, they did exist. We just didn't know a name for them. It's great Granny Weatherwax from Terry Pratchett. Just because you didn't know the name of it doesn't mean you don't know what it is. Anyway, so this bit that stuck with me. We may take advantage of this pause in the narrative to make certain statements, Orlando had become a woman, and there's no denying it. His memory, but in future we must, for convention's sake, say her for his and she for he. They had been at great pains to prove that 1. Orlando had always been a woman, or 2. That Orlando is at this moment a man. Let biologists and psychologists determine. It is enough for us to state this simple fact: Orlando was a man until the age of 30, when he became a woman, and has remained so ever since. Now, it's a short version of that paragraph when he wakes up and he is now she. But it always stuck with me as sort of like a moment of, that sort of that moment of revelation that I don't want to be a man, I want to be a woman, and sort of pursuing that to the point where he abandons everything about his life to go and become a woman with this traveling tribe for a while. And that's obviously not what Virginia Woolf was going for, because it was 1928, the suffragette movement, women's votes. She was probably exploring, as many writers were at the time, the difference between the gender expectations. And that's even brought up when Orlando returns to England, and she's surprised at how suddenly she's not able to do anything compared to the tribe that she was with, because they treated their women equally, and in England they didn't. So she was almost certainly doing that, exploring those gender differences, those gender expectations. But for me, reading with a 21st century perspective, I saw it entirely different. I saw a narrative of someone making their realization and coming to terms with that they are not the person that they want to be, so they're going to become one instead. That's part of why translation is so difficult historically, because, there are people online who say, like, oh, it's a woke agenda, oh, it's LGBT madness, autism didn't exist back in my day. I'm sorry to say, but it did. It did. And before you go back to your train set that you've been obsessed with for some reason that you can't understand, let me just point out, it's not a new narrative. It's not something that people are being converted in. The ancient Greeks were talking about the Odyssey, for crying out loud. The ancient Greeks were incredibly homoerotic. I'm going way off track. I'm going to cut this back. But the main point I want to make, okay, with that, is that when meanings change, when culture changes, it makes looking back so much more difficult. Because when you look back and you think, oh yeah, I think that these characters are representing this, you're using the 21st century context, and you're not using the context that it was written in. So I'm about to wrap up, but just one more thing. And this is me just sort of like pushing a little bit more regarding one of the comments that Solomon responded to, and that was about the constant use of the word slave. Now, Solomon already went over this in great detail, so I don't really need to expand on it. But the reason that some words are constantly used, like slave, with just an adjective form instead, is because that we don't really have slaves anymore. Or rather, we shouldn't. But we see it as something wrong. We see it as something bad. And therefore, we don't see the need to keep differentiating it. We don't need a word for, housemaid slave or unpaid urchin slave or gladiator slave. We don't need those separate words, because we just label it as something bad, as something evil. So because we don't make use of that, because our culture has completely changed, unfortunately, when you have a text that has a lot of slaves in it, and the original language may have had, fancy words to mean all these different slaves, we just have slave. And that's simply because, why should we differentiate it when we know it's evil? Why should we create a whole new word for something that we have no interest in exploring any further? Let me give you a recent example. MP3. Yeah, that's an old word, isn't it? Obviously, the MP3 format still exists, but the concept of MP3s and MP3 players is basically gone. And this is in the last 10, 15 years. We don't say anymore, that, oh yeah, I just downloaded a bunch of MP3 songs to my MP3 player. No, we don't. What we say is, We call songs, well, songs, and we call MP3 players Spotify. Not sponsored. Um, when a word has fallen out of use, as Solomon has already explained in depth, if you want to translate a text and you're getting fed up with using the same word over and over again, and trust me, I'm an English teacher, I see same words in narratives all the time, and it's so frustrating. But if you want to swap out, slave for page, for example, well, that's just a servant. That's a servant from a completely different context, and that completely changes the meaning. And that implies that this person is not a slave. That implies that this person has a life outside of their service. Not much of one, but they have one. That there's potential some room for improvement going forward because a page could become a squire potentially. So, oh dear, someone might correct me on that one. Don't know. But my point is, and my point of all of this video is just to say that translation is difficult. There's never going to be any one right way to translate a text that is old or centuries old or thousands of years old. There's not going to be any one way because the original text was written with a different context, with words that have different meanings, and in a rhythm that we would struggle to recreate today. That's the general gist of it. Translation is hard, and there's never going to be one perfect translation. There's never going to be one perfect adaptation. All we can do is try and do our best. I'm Mr. Smith. I hope you've enjoyed this video. This is my first video. You probably can tell. Yeah, I feel like I should say something like and subscribe, but I don't think I've earned it yet. So what I want to say is just stick around, because I am wanting to make more of these videos regarding English, not just about Shakespeare, about things like methods, or even that word I keep throwing out, context. So many people aren't using context anymore, and I want to make a video on that. And I want to explore Romeo and Juliet, or Othello, and other fantastic stories with the world. I could teach within my classroom, but I want to teach more. So hopefully you can stick around and see if there's something you like. And if not, well, I'm glad you stayed for this video. Thank you very much. Take care. She is the fairy's midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone, on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomi over men's noses as they fall asleep.